The courtroom was silent, so silent that every small sound echoed against the walls. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of old wood and paper. The ceiling fans turned slowly, almost lazily, as if they too were waiting for what would happen next. In the middle of the room, Keanu Reeves stood, wearing a simple black suit, his hands resting loosely in front of him. He looked calm, maybe too calm, but his eyes had a weight in them, a quiet strength that made people unsure of what he was truly feeling around him. The benches were full. People sat close together, strangers whispering to each other in low voices. The press was there too, cameras and microphones ready, reporters scribbling notes while trying not to miss a single moment. Outside the building, hundreds of people were gathered, some holding signs with his name, others just curious to see what would happen. The judge sat high above on the bench, his black robe neat and pressed, his face unreadable. For weeks the trial had been going on, and now it was time for the decision. The prosecution had spoken with confidence, painting Keanu as someone capable of the crime they accused him of. They had no strong proof, but they had words, and sometimes words can be powerful. Keanu's lawyer sat beside him, his jaw tight, his hands gripping a pen so hard it almost snapped. He had done everything he could, but there was a feeling in the air that things might not go their way. Still, Keanu didn't speak. He didn't lean over to ask questions. He just stood there, eyes lowered, as if he was thinking about something far away. When the judge finally began to speak, the words were slow, heavy, each one falling into the room like a stone into water. "This court finds the defendant guilty," he said. A collective gasp filled the room. Some people's hands flew to their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. It didn't make sense. This was Keanu Reeves, the man known for his kindness, the man who gave quietly to charities and treated strangers with respect. How could he be guilty of anything like this? The judge didn't stop there. He continued, his voice steady. "The sentence is life in prison." For a moment, the words didn't seem real. It was as if time had frozen. The sound of a pen dropping to the floor was louder than it should have been. The reporter's pen started moving again, scribbling the headline that would soon flash across every screen in the country. Keanu finally looked up, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm that almost felt strange. He nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting this. His lawyer whispered something to him, his lips moving quickly, but Keanu just placed a hand on the man's arm, a small gesture that said, "It's all right." People in the gallery began to murmur, their voices rising with emotion. One woman in the back stood up and called out, "This is wrong." But the bailiff quickly motioned for her to sit. The judge banged his gavel once, twice, and the sound brought everyone back to silence. Keanu's mind was somewhere else now. He wasn't thinking about the sentence. He wasn't thinking about the cold cell that waited for him. He was thinking about the journey that had led to this moment, about how something so small, so misunderstood, had grown into this storm. As the guards stepped forward, their footsteps firm on the polished floor, Keanu didn't resist. They took his wrist gently but firmly. The cold touch of the handcuffs clicked into place. Flashes from cameras filled the air, each one capturing the moment for the world to see. Walking toward the side door, Keanu passed by faces he knew, friends, colleagues, even strangers who had come to support him. Some looked at him with pity, others with confusion. But he didn't break his calm. One step after another, he left the bright lights of the courtroom for the dim hallway beyond. Outside, the noise was deafening. The crowd roared with questions. Reporters shouted his name. But he didn't stop to answer. The guards led him to a waiting van, its doors already open. He climbed inside without hesitation. The doors slammed shut, and the sound echoed like a final note in a song. For those who watched him driven away, it felt like the end of something. But Keanu knew it wasn't the end. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty told him that the truth had a way of finding its path, even if it took time. For now, though, all he could do was sit in the back of that van, feeling the engine start. the road moving beneath them, and the world outside shifting into something he had never imagined for himself. It had all started weeks before that courtroom day. In a bright hall filled with music, laughter, and the smell of fresh coffee, the place was decorated with colorful banners, each one showing smiling children from around the world. It was a charity event, one meant to raise money for schools and food programs in poor areas. Keanu had been invited not as a celebrity to pose for cameras, but as someone who truly cared. He had always been known for supporting such causes quietly, without asking for attention. That evening, the tables were full. People in suits and dresses talked about donations, some bidding in a silent auction, others simply enjoying the performances on stage. Keanu moved between tables, shaking hands, smiling, listening to people's stories. He was dressed simply, no bodyguards, no big entrance, just blending in like everyone else, but somewhere in the crowd was a man who didn't come to help. This man was important in the city, a businessman with power, influence, and many friends in high places. For reasons no one understood at the time, he already disliked Keanu. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe something else. What mattered was that he had a plan. Later in the night, the music was still playing when a small commotion started near the back of the hall. A chair fell over, voices rose, and suddenly the businessman was on the floor, holding his arm. People rushed over, asking if he was hurt. The man pointed a finger, his voice loud and sharp. "He pushed me. He attacked me," he said, and his finger was aimed straight at Keanu. The room froze. People looked from the man on the floor to Keanu, who stood a few feet away, his hands open, confusion in his eyes. "I didn't touch you," he said calmly, but his voice was almost lost in the noise that followed. Security rushed in. Some of them knew Keanu well, but they still had to follow procedure. The businessman kept repeating his accusation, saying he had been insulted, shoved, and humiliated in front of donors. A few guests whispered, unsure of what they had really seen. After all, in a crowded room, it's easy for stories to twist quickly. By the time the police arrived, the businessman's version of events had already spread. He spoke with such confidence, such certainty, that the officers treated the matter as serious. Keanu didn't resist when they asked him to step aside. He answered their questions clearly, still calm, still respectful, but it didn't matter. An official complaint had been made. The newspapers the next morning were full of headlines, some soft, some harsh. Shock at charity gala, actor accused of assault, beloved star in legal trouble, photos of Keanu leaving the event in the company of officers made it look worse than it was. Friends called him, confused. What happened? They asked, and Keanu simply told them the truth. Nothing had happened, at least not the way the papers said. But he didn't rush to make public statements. He didn't run to television to defend himself. Instead, he let the legal process move forward, trusting that the truth would be enough. The problem was, the businessman was not just any man. His reach was long. His friends were in the right positions, and in quiet corners of the city. Deals were made over coffee and whispered words. Witnesses who had seen nothing started to remember details, little pieces that, when put together, seemed to support the accusation. Keanu's lawyer began to notice something strange. Doors that should have been opened to them were suddenly closed. Phone calls that should have been returned went unanswered. It was as if an invisible hand was quietly guiding the case in one direction. The public, too, began to divide. Some believed this was all nonsense, pointing to years of Keanu's gentle and generous nature. They remembered stories of him giving away money, helping strangers, taking pay cuts so others could be paid more. But others, swayed by the loud voices on television, wondered if they had been wrong about him all along. In the middle of it all, Keanu stayed the same, his routine unchanged. He visited the small cafe near his home, smiled at the barista, signed autographs when asked. He didn't hide from the world, but he also didn't fight it with anger. It was as if he knew storms come and go, and only the truth can last. Yet behind the scenes, the case was building like a wave. and when it finally reached the courtroom, it hit with full force. The businessman told his story again, this time under oath, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the jury. The lawyers argued back and forth. Evidence was thin, but in a battle of appearances, the man with influence often has the edge, and so, what began as an evening of kindness and charity had twisted into something dangerous. A small moment turned into a weapon, and Keanu found himself standing in a fight he never started, one where being good was not enough to protect him. The story spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, it was on television, in newspapers, on social media, and even in the conversations of people in cafes and buses. It seemed like everyone had an opinion. Some people were shocked and refused to believe the news. Others said it didn't matter how famous or kind someone was. The law was the law. The whole city felt like it had taken sides overnight. On one side were the people who had followed Keanu's career for years. They remembered his quiet acts of kindness, how he gave up his seat for strangers, how he donated millions without wanting his name mentioned. To them, the idea that he would hurt someone was unthinkable. They saw the accusation as a mistake, a misunderstanding, or even something worse, a setup. They filled online comment sections defending him, writing long posts about the good things he had done. On the other side were those who believed the businessman's story completely. They pointed to the court decision to move forward with the trial as proof that something serious must have happened. Courts don't just waste time on nothing, they said. There must be evidence. They didn't know what that evidence was, but they trusted the process. The news channels fed the division. Some programs invited experts to discuss the case. One legal expert said Keanu's calm in court was suspicious. If an innocent man hears he might go to prison, wouldn't he fight harder? He asked. Another program brought in a charity worker who spoke of how humble Keanu had been that night, how he had spent more time listening to children than talking to donors. It was like two different stories were being told at the same time. Even people close to Keanu felt the pressure. Some of his friends received calls from reporters asking if they had ever seen him lose his temper. One or two, under the heat of questioning, admitted that yes, like any person, he had bad days. And those small comments became headlines. Friend admits actor has temper. The words were twisted. The meaning stretched until it fit the story people wanted to hear. Keanu himself refused to be pulled into the noise. He didn't go on television. He didn't post angry messages online. He didn't try to win over the public with emotional speeches. Instead, he went about his days quietly, meeting with his lawyer, preparing for court, and continuing small acts of kindness that no one asked him to do. To him, the people's opinion mattered less than the truth coming out in court. But the silence only made some people more suspicious. They wanted a show. They wanted a fight. When they didn't get it, they decided he must have nothing to say in his defense. Meanwhile, the businessman seemed to be everywhere, giving interviews, speaking at charity events, talking about the pain and humiliation he had suffered, always reminding the public that he was simply seeking justice. There were moments when it seemed like the case wasn't just about what happened at the charity event anymore. It was about image, about who the public trusted more, in a world where a photograph could change how millions saw you. The businessman's well-rehearsed expressions and emotional pauses played in his favor. Behind closed doors, Keanu's legal team struggled. They knew how unfair the situation was. They knew how much of the case rested on perception instead of facts. The lack of solid evidence should have made things easy, but it didn't. Because influence has its own kind of power, one that doesn't always follow rules. The public divide became so sharp that even strangers argued about it. In restaurants, two tables would be eating quietly until someone mentioned Keanu's name. Then voices would rise, hands would wave. People who had never met him acted as if they knew his heart. Yet through all of this, Keanu's behavior never changed. One day, a fan approached him at a small grocery store, shyly asking if she could take a picture, even with everything going on. He smiled and agreed. thanking her for her support. The moment was small, but it showed the same man people had always known, for the people who believed in him. Moments like that felt like proof that they were right, for those who doubted him. It didn't matter. They thought anyone could smile for a camera. The truth was lost in a storm of opinions. As the trial date drew closer, the noise only grew louder. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about a story people could follow, a drama they could invest in, and in that drama, Keanu was painted either as the wronged hero or the fallen idol, nothing in between, and so the lines were drawn. The public was split, and every day the tension built, neither side willing to believe the other, while the man at the center of it all simply waited, knowing that the real fight was not on television, not in newspapers, but in the courtroom where the truth, hopefully, would finally be heard. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing through the long, dim hallway. The air smelled of concrete, disinfectant, and something older, something like rust. Keanu walked slowly, his wrists still marked from the handcuffs. 2 guards led him forward without speaking, their boots thudding against the hard floor. Every step took him further away from the world he knew and deeper into the one he had only seen in movies. When they reached his cell, the door was already open. It was small, barely enough space for 2 narrow beds, a toilet in the corner, and a small metal sink. The walls were bare, except for a few scratches and faded graffiti left by past inmates. A man sat on the lower bunk, his head bent as he flipped through an old paperback book. He looked up for only a second, his eyes sharp but not unfriendly, then went back to his reading. "This is you," one guard said simply, then stepped back. The other locked the door with a loud click. The sound of the lock felt final, like a sentence within a sentence. Keanu set his small bundle of belongings on the bed. There wasn't much: a folded blanket, a pillow, and a cup. For a few minutes, the cell was silent except for the rustle of the pages. Keanu sat on his bunk, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't try to make conversation. He understood that, in this place, respect often began with space. The man on the lower bunk finally closed his book and glanced at him. "You're the movie guy," he said. Not as a question but as a statement. Keanu smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess I am." The man nodded once, then opened his book again. The first day moved slowly, the loud buzzers signaling mealtimes, the echo of footsteps in the hall, the distant shouts from other cells. Keanu walked into the cafeteria with the others, carrying a metal tray. Some inmates stared, some whispered, a few even smirked, but no one came too close. He sat at an empty table, quietly eating the plain food. By the end of the week, people had started to notice something about him. He didn't complain, didn't argue, and didn't treat anyone with disrespect. When one older inmate struggled to carry his tray, Keanu stepped forward to help. No big gesture, just a simple act. But in a place where kindness was rare, it stood out. His cellmate began to talk more, telling him about the unspoken rules of the prison, who to avoid, how to move without drawing trouble, how to stay invisible when it mattered. Keanu listened, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that surviving here meant understanding the people around him. The guards, too, started to notice his behavior. He followed orders without attitude. He didn't try to charm them, but he also never ignored their presence. When assigned to the prison workshop, he learned the tasks quickly, sanding wood and assembling simple furniture. The pay was small, but he used what little he earned to buy books from the prison library for others who couldn't afford them. One afternoon, while waiting in line for his meal, he heard 2 inmates arguing loudly. The tension was sharp, voices rising, fists clenched. Before things could explode, Keanu stepped between them, not with force, but with calm words, telling them it wasn't worth it. One man scoffed, but the others slowly backed down. The moment passed and no punches were thrown. Word spread quickly. The new guy wasn't just polite. He could cool down trouble without making enemies. Despite his quiet nature, Prison life was still hard. The nights were long. The sounds of metal doors, muffled crying, and the occasional shout filling the darkness. Sometimes Keanu lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how he had ended up here, thinking about the charity event, the false words, the trial, the judge's final sentence. But he didn't let bitterness grow. Instead, he focused on the small things he could do each day to keep his mind steady. One evening, his cellmate asked him why he didn't seem angry. "You got life for something you say you didn't do. Most people would be losing it." Keanu paused for a long moment before answering. "Anger's easy, but it doesn't help. You walk through fire." His voice was soft, but the words stayed with his cellmate. Day by day, he began to form quiet connections. A young inmate in the workshop started saving scraps of wood so Keanu could carve small figures. An older man in the library set aside certain books he thought Keanu would like. It wasn't friendship in the usual sense, but it was a kind of respect, even here, in the cold, controlled world of prison. Keanu's nature was the same, helping, without expecting thanks, listening without judgment, sharing without counting. And without even realizing it, he was changing the way people saw him, not as the famous actor accused of a crime, but as the man in the cell who treated everyone like they still had worth. It was the 27th day since Keanu had walked through the prison gates. The morning began like all the others, the loud buzzers waking everyone, the metallic clatter of breakfast trays, the shuffle of feet in the corridor. Keanu sat quietly at his bunk, sipping from a small cup of coffee. The taste was bitter, but it warmed him in the cold air. He had learned to take comfort in small things. After breakfast, he was sent to the workshop as usual. The sound of machines humming filled the space, sawdust floating in the air like soft dust from another world. Keanu worked steadily, sanding the edge of a wooden chair, the rhythm of his hands keeping his mind calm. Nothing in the morning hinted that this day would be different. It was close to midday when a guard appeared at the workshop door, his voice cutting through the noise. "Reeves," he called. A few heads turned, surprised. The guard didn't usually speak names unless something serious was happening. Keanu put down the sandpaper, wiped his hands, and walked over. The guard's expression was unreadable. "You've got a call," he said. A phone call inside prison was rare, especially for someone who had only been there less than a month. As they walked down the corridor, Keanu's mind tried to guess who it could be. His lawyer, a family member, maybe a friend checking in. But something about the guard's tone told him this was not a normal call. They reached a small office near the administration wing. The guard opened the door, and inside was a desk with a black phone, the receiver resting in its cradle. The prison officer at the desk gave a short nod. "Pick it up," he said. Keanu sat down, the chair's legs scraping the floor, and lifted the phone to his ear. There was a pause, just the sound of faint static, then a voice, quiet at first. "Keanu?" It asked. He recognized it immediately, though he hadn't heard it in years. It was someone from the businessman's inner circle, a person who had once worked closely with him, someone Keanu remembered as decent and honest. The voice was shaking. I can't let this go on," they said. Keanu didn't speak. He just listened. The voice grew stronger. It was a lie, the whole thing. "He made it up," they continued. Every word was like a door opening. "That night at the charity event. You didn't touch him, you didn't insult him, nothing. He planned it, because he wanted to embarrass you, and because some people wanted you out of the way." The confession spilled out quickly, as if they had been holding it in for too long. The person on the other end said they had proof, messages, documents, and even a recording. They had kept it hidden out of fear. But watching Keanu sit in prison for something he didn't do had become too much for them. "I'm going to the authorities today," they said firmly. "By tonight, they'll know the truth." For a long moment, Keanu said nothing. The weight of the words settling into him. He didn't feel anger, not even relief yet, just a deep, quiet sense that the tide was turning. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. "Thank you. 2 simple words, but they carried everything he felt, the person. On the line exhaled sharply, as if releasing years of tension. "I'm sorry it took me this long." They said, "Hold on just a little longer." The line went silent, and then the call was over. Keanu set the phone down slowly, his hands resting on the desk for a moment. Before he stood, the guard who had brought him there didn't ask questions. But there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Back to work?" he asked. Keanu nodded. Back to work. Walking down the corridor again, Keanu felt different. The walls didn't seem as heavy, the air didn't feel as cold. He knew nothing was certain until the proof was in court, but for the first time since the trial, there was light at the end of the path. That afternoon, he worked in the workshop as if nothing had happened, but inside, he carried the voice from the call, the promise that the truth was finally moving toward the surface. He didn't tell anyone, not even his cellmate. He kept it to himself, letting the moment live quietly in his chest. When the day ended and the cell door locked for the night, Keanu lay on his bunk, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling. He thought about how one phone call could change everything, how it could take a man from a place of no hope to a place where freedom felt possible again. He knew the fight wasn't over, but now he wasn't fighting alone. The next morning began like any other, but outside the prison walls, the world was already changing. While Keanu sat quietly at his small metal table, sipping the weak coffee that passed for breakfast, the truth was starting to spread. The person who had called him had gone straight to the authorities, carrying a folder stuffed with papers, printed messages, and a small recording device. In a quiet government office, investigators listened as the confession played. The voice of the businessman himself could be heard, laughing with 2 other men. The words were clear, unmistakable. He spoke about how easy it had been to frame Keanu, how the public would believe anything if it came from someone powerful enough. There was no hesitation, no guilt in his tone, only arrogance. The recording ended with him saying, "By the time anyone figures it out, he'll already be forgotten." The evidence was strong, but the investigators knew it needed to be handled carefully. A false conviction of someone so well known could shake public trust. By midday, news outlets had already started receiving anonymous tips, small pieces of the truth leaking out. The headline shifted from "Actor's life sentence stands" to "New evidence could overturn Reeves' conviction." Inside the prison, Keanu noticed a change in the way some guards looked at him. A certain stiffness replaced with quiet respect. One even paused during the midday head count, giving him a subtle nod. His cellmate, who rarely spoke about outside news, whispered, "Something's happening out there." But Keanu only smiled faintly. By late afternoon, his lawyer arrived unexpectedly. Calling him to the visitor room, they sat across from each other with a glass wall between them. The phone connecting their voices crackled slightly. His lawyer's face was lit with a cautious but undeniable excitement. "We have it," he said without wasting time. "Proof, real proof, and the DA is furious about the whole thing." He explained how the whistleblower had come forward, how the recording left no room for doubt, how the messages matched the timeline perfectly. Keanu listened without interrupting, absorbing every detail. The lawyer leaned closer to the glass, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "We're going back to court. Not next month, not next week. Tomorrow." The words hit like a sudden ray of sunlight through storm clouds. That evening, as he returned to his cell, the prison seemed quieter than usual. Word had already spread among the inmates that something big was happening. A few called out to him from their cells, not in mockery but in support. "Looks like you're getting out." "Reeves," one man said with a grin. Another simply raised a fist in silent solidarity. The next morning before dawn, he was taken from his cell and given clean clothes. The van ride to the courthouse was long, the street still empty in the early light. His lawyer met him at the entrance, walking beside him as cameras flashed wildly. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a storm of noise. Keanu kept his eyes forward, inside the courtroom. The atmosphere was completely different from the day he had been sentenced. This time, there was no smug confidence from the other side. The businessman sat pale and tense, his lawyer whispering urgently to him. The judge looked down from the bench, his expression firm but not hostile. The prosecutor, now armed with the new evidence, laid everything out piece by piece. The messages that proved the plan, the recording that caught the lies in the businessman's own voice, the financial trail showing payments to certain witnesses. The courtroom was silent except for the prosecutor's steady voice. When the recording was played aloud, the words filled the room, and there was no mistaking them. Every person present could hear the cruelty, the calculated malice. The judge's eyebrows drew together, his lips pressing into a thin line. When the clip ended, the air felt heavier. Keanu's lawyer spoke next, not in anger, but with calm precision. He reminded the court of Keanu's years of generosity, of the lack of any real evidence against him before, of the damage done not just to his career, but to his life. This man has spent nearly a month behind bars for something he did not do, the lawyer said, because of lies told for personal gain. The judge leaned forward, his voice measured but strong. Given this new evidence, the court finds that the previous conviction cannot stand. He paused, letting the words settle. Mr. Reeves, you are hereby released from custody, effective immediately. Gasps and murmurs filled the room, but Keanu simply bowed his head slightly, a small, almost humble smile touching his lips. He didn't look at the businessman, he didn't need to. The truth had done all the speaking for him. As the guards stepped back, the weight of the handcuffs was gone, and he took his first free steps in weeks. Outside, the street was a sea of cameras and voices. Reporters calling his name, fans cheering, some even crying. But Keanu didn't rush to speak. He walked calmly to the waiting car with his lawyer, the sun on his face feeling like something he hadn't known he'd missed so much. Deep down, he knew his life had changed forever, but so had the lives of the people who had watched justice finally win. The air outside the courthouse felt different, almost lighter. The sun was warm on Keanu's face, and the sound of the city seemed sharper, clearer. After weeks of hearing only the echoes of prison corridors, the world felt wide again. Reporters pressed forward, their voices overlapping as they shouted questions. Microphones and cameras pushing close. Fans stood behind the barriers, cheering his name, some with tears in their eyes. Keanu didn't rush to speak. He kept walking at a steady pace, his lawyer beside him. The courthouse steps felt longer than they really were, each one carrying him further away from the place where he had been labeled guilty. The crowd surged when he reached the sidewalk, the flashes of cameras almost blinding. A woman in the front row of the crowd shouted, "We knew you didn't do it." And Keanu gave her a small, grateful nod. His lawyer opened the car door, but before getting in, Keanu paused for a moment. He turned toward the crowd and raised a hand in a simple wave. No speech, no dramatic words, just a quiet thank you in his eyes. It was enough. The people understood. Once inside the car, the noise outside faded, replaced by the soft hum of the engine. He leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly, as if letting go of something heavy he had carried for too long. The ride from the courthouse was filled with moments of silence. His lawyer talked about the next steps, clearing his record officially, filing claims against those who had wronged him. But Keanu didn't respond much. He was looking out the window, watching the city pass by. The streets were alive with people going about their day, unaware of the storm he had just stepped out of. When they reached his apartment, the familiar building looked almost unreal, as if it had been part of a dream he wasn't sure he'd return to. Stepping inside, he was greeted by the quiet smell of home, the faint scent of wood from the bookshelves, the softness of the couch cushions when he sat down. It was strange how something so ordinary could feel so precious. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't check his phone right away. Instead, he went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. The taste was simple, clean, but it was his. not handed to him in a plastic cup by a guard. He stood there for a moment, just feeling the difference. Later that afternoon, a few close friends came by. People who had believed in him from the start. They hugged him tightly, some without saying a word. One of them placed a small paper bag on the table. Inside was his favorite pastry from a cafe he used to visit. "Thought you'd want something better than prison food," they joked softly. Keanu laughed, the sound feeling almost new to him. Still, there was no ignoring the weight of what had happened. His name had been cleared legally, but he knew that not everyone would hear the truth. Some people would remember only the headlines from before, not the evidence that proved his innocence. He accepted that, because chasing everyone's opinion wasn't his way. Instead, he focused on the fact that he was free, that he could choose what to do next. That evening, as the sun set, Keanu stepped onto his balcony. The city lights began to flicker on below. He could hear distant traffic, the faint sound of laughter from a nearby street. He thought about the people still inside prison who were innocent but had no one to fight for them. The thought stayed with him, shaping something quietly in his heart. He didn't feel anger toward the businessman who had lied, at least not the kind that wanted revenge. He felt something colder, deeper, a certainty that the man would face his own truth eventually. Whether in court or in his own conscience, for Keanu, the victory wasn't about crushing anyone. It was about walking out of that prison with his dignity still intact. Before going to bed that night, he sat in his living room with a notebook and pen. He wrote down a few ideas, not for movies, not for himself, but for ways to help people who had been falsely accused. It wasn't a full plan yet, but it was a start. As he turned off the light, the apartment settled into quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel like isolation, but like peace. He lay down in his own bed for the first time in weeks, the sheets soft against his skin, the air calm and still. His last thought before sleep was simple. Freedom didn't just mean being outside prison walls. It meant being able to choose kindness, even after injustice. And that was something no one could take from him again. The morning after his first night back home, Keanu woke to the soft light of the sun filtering through the curtains. For a moment, he just lay there, listening to the quiet. It was a stillness he hadn't felt in weeks. No clanging doors, no shouted orders, no constant footsteps in the hall, just peace. He sat up slowly, stretching, the warmth of the sunlight on his face making him close his eyes for a second. He made himself breakfast, nothing fancy, just eggs, toast, and coffee, but each bite felt special, not because of the taste, but because he was free to make it for himself. He didn't have to line up with a tray or eat in a noisy room. After eating, he sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, thinking about the last month, the trial, the prison, and the phone call that had changed everything. Keanu knew he could move on quietly, go back to his career, live his life, and let the memory fade. But he also knew that most people who were falsely accused didn't have his resources. They didn't have lawyers or fans or someone willing to come forward with the truth. They often stayed behind bars, forgotten. The thought bothered him more than the time he had spent in prison himself. That day, instead of going into hiding or avoiding the public, Keanu called his lawyer and asked to meet with organizations that help the wrongly convicted. His lawyer was surprised. "You just got out. Most people would take a break," he said. But Keanu simply replied, "I had people who fought for me. Now I want to fight for someone else." A few days later, he met with volunteers from a legal aid group. They told him stories of men and women who had been in prison for years, even decades, for crimes they didn't commit. Some were still waiting for their cases to be reviewed. Others had already been released but had lost everything: their jobs, their homes, their families. Keanu listened quietly, asking questions, taking notes. When news of his meeting got out, reporters tried to spin it as a public relations move, but those who met him knew it wasn't for the cameras. He didn't make speeches, he didn't pose for photos. He just wanted to know how he could help. Soon after, He announced a donation to the group, large enough to fund several investigations into wrongful convictions. One afternoon, small press conference, a reporter asked him why he was doing this when he could be focusing on rebuilding his career. Keanu smiled slightly and said, "It's not about me. It's about the people who don't have a voice. I had the chance to walk out, and they should too." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The public began to see his release, not just as the end of his own ordeal, but as the start of something bigger. Letters poured in from people thanking him for speaking out. Some shared their own experiences with injustice. Others simply wished him well. Keanu read many of them. Late at night, sometimes feeling the heaviness of how much pain was hidden in the world. One story stayed with him, a young man who had been in prison for 8 years for a robbery he didn't commit. The case had gone cold because no one had the money to reopen it. Keanu quietly covered the legal costs, never telling the man who had helped. Months later, when the man was released, he sent a letter to the anonymous donor saying, "You didn't just give me my freedom, you gave me my life back." Keanu kept that letter in his desk, a reminder of why he had chosen this path. He also began visiting schools, talking to students about truth, kindness, and the importance of standing up for what's right. He didn't talk much about his own case unless asked, but when he did, he focused on the people who had stood by him, and how one person's decision to speak the truth had changed everything. Despite everything he had gone through, Keanu never let bitterness take root. He didn't waste time wishing things had been different. Instead, he poured his energy into making things better for someone else, in quiet ways. A legal fee paid here, a family's rent covered there, a call made to check on someone still fighting their case. He became a silent guardian for people who had almost given up hope. In the years that followed, his story became more than just about an actor falsely accused. It became a lesson in grace and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, it's possible to choose compassion over revenge. And for Keanu, that choice wasn't about being a hero. It was simply about being human. And so, the call that had freed him didn't just change his life. It changed the lives of many others, proving that kindness, even after the darkest moments, can ripple outward in ways no one can predict.